On April 9, 1241, in Legnica, Poland, Henry the Pious, the Duke of Sicily, observed his adversaries in flight. Approximately 20,000 Christian knights and soldiers, representing the finest Polish and German cavalry, stood on the battlefield, witnessing the retreat of the Mongol horsemen as their steeds galloped away, raising clouds of dust. The enemy was in full retreat, and Henry made a fatal decision. He commanded a charge. His knights broke ranks, and their heavy war horses charged forward with clanking armor and fluttering banners, convinced of their imminent victory. They pursued the fleeing Mongols across the open plains, increasing their speed, spreading out, and losing formation with every stride. Then a thick black smoke appeared, enveloping their flanks. Its origin was unknown. Some accounts suggest the Mongols employed a smoke weapon, possibly naphtha, to blind and disorient their pursuers. From within this smoke, horns blared. The Mongols ceased their retreat, turning as one. The entire withdrawing force inverted its direction, and the concealed flanking cavalry swung inward from both sides. Henry's army, stretched out across half a mile of open ground and no longer in formation, with horses growing weary, advanced directly into a pincer movement. The battle concluded in less than an hour. Henry II, Duke of Silesia, perished on that field. His severed head was displayed on a spear outside Legnica's walls. The Mongols reportedly removed the right ear from each Christian soldier killed that day, sending 9 full sacks of them back to their commander. 9 sacks. And what is truly astonishing is that this was not the main Mongol army. It was a flanking contingent. The primary invasion was simultaneously unfolding in Hungary, 200 miles away, where a separate Mongol army executed a nearly identical trap against King Baylor IV at the Battle of Mohi that same week. This coordination across 2 countries, preceding the telegraph, radio, or any modern communication means, exemplifies the true nature of Mongol cavalry. It wasn't merely men on horseback or their speed and aggression. It was a military system so far ahead of its time that its victims couldn't comprehend what was happening. So the danger posed by the Mongols is not the real question. Everyone acknowledges that. The true question, the one that troubles historians, is how they achieved this. How did a nomadic people from the steppe, lacking cities, formal militaries, and an industrial base, develop into the most effective cavalry force in military history? The answer predates any battle and stems from something so fundamental that it's often overlooked: the unappreciated horse. Let me explain the significance of the Mongolian horse, as understanding it is crucial to comprehending the Mongol military machine. When European chroniclers first encountered Mongol war horses, they were bewildered. Matthew Paris, an English monk from the 1240s, described them as small, stocky, almost pony-like creatures. He struggled to reconcile these unassuming animals with the apocalyptic army they carried. The horses seemed inadequate, unsuitable for the task. This misconception proved to be a critical error. The Mongolian horse is not fast. It would lose to an Arabian thoroughbred or a European destrier on a straight track. However, this comparison is irrelevant, as wars are not fought on straight tracks under ideal conditions. Wars traverse steppes, mountains, frozen rivers, and deserts for months on end, without supply depots. For this type of warfare, the kind the Mongols waged, the Mongolian horse was not merely sufficient, it was optimal. These horses could cover 95 to 120 kilometers daily, not as an exception, but consistently. They required no grain and, in winter, would dig through snow with their hooves to find grass. They endured temperatures lethal to other breeds. In essence, they were militarily self-sufficient. Consider the strategic implications. Every major medieval army was burdened by its supply chain, feeding horses, feeding men, and maintaining wagon movement. This logistical reality slowed every campaign, made winter warfare almost impossible, and confined armies to roads and rivers where food was accessible. The Mongols faced no such constraints. Their horses liberated them from the tether that other armies unknowingly wore. They could move at will, in conditions no one else could tolerate. This was not merely a tactical advantage, it was a strategic revolution. Each Mongol fighter typically brought multiple horses, usually 3 to 5, with them during their military expeditions. They would alternate riding one while the others rested, maintaining a continuous rotation. Giovanni d'Arpini, a Franciscan friar who visited the Mongol court in the 1240s, recorded that a warrior would not remount the same horse until it had recuperated for 3 or 4 days. This system allowed the entire army to move as a continuous, self-sustaining relay of horseflesh, virtually immune to exhaustion. This swiftness astonished their contemporaries, enabling Mongol forces to strike a target, disappear, and then re-emerge elsewhere entirely. They covered ground so rapidly that enemy commanders, upon receiving intelligence of one Mongol column, would often discover a different column already behind them. However, there's a largely overlooked aspect of this relationship. The Mongolian horse was far more than just a means of transport. It served as a comprehensive field support system for the cavalry. During extended campaigns when food was scarce, warriors could make a small incision in a horse's neck vein, draw a controlled amount of blood, perhaps a liter, consume it for sustenance, and then close the wound. The horse would survive, the warrior would survive, and the campaign would continue. This practice, corroborated by observers like Marco Polo, meant the Mongol army possessed an unparalleled mobile food supply. Furthermore, these horses supplied milk, which could be fermented into airog, a staple alcoholic beverage in the Mongol diet. Their hides provided leather for armor, footwear, and various equipment, while their tendons were crucial for fabricating bowstrings. In critical survival situations, they also served as a source of meat. The Mongol horse was not merely a weapon platform, it constituted the entire logistical foundation for an army that required no other logistical base. The bond between a Mongol fighter and his horse was deeply personal, directly impacting their effectiveness in battle. Historical accounts describe well-trained Mongol war horses responding to their rider's whistle, following them like a dog. This wasn't merely a reaction to rain pressure. It stemmed from a relationship cultivated over years of daily interaction. In combat, this meant the rider's hands were entirely unburdened, as the horse acted as a willing partner in maneuvers rather than a large animal being forcibly controlled. Yet, horses alone don't explain everything, because the horse and rider formed an inseparable unit. The rider had been preparing for this his entire life. Mongol children began riding at 3 or 4 years old, not merely learning to ride, but actively riding. By the age of 10, a Mongol boy had accumulated more hours on horseback than most medieval European knights would in their entire careers. By the time he was old enough for battle, the horse wasn't a vehicle he operated, it was an extension of his own body. This distinction is critical for one particular reason: it freed his hands. A European knight on horseback had to focus on staying mounted, dividing his attention, with his hands partially occupied with control. In contrast, a Mongol warrior, having ridden since before he could read, no more thought about riding than one thinks about walking. It was automatic, leaving both hands free for the bow. And the bow was a game changer. The Mongols viewed hunting and warfare as fundamentally the same activity. Their grand hunts, known as nurg, were not recreational but structured military exercises, sometimes involving thousands of riders encircling a vast steppe area and gradually tightening their formation to trap animals. The coordination, patience, and ability to maintain tight formations across miles of open terrain were precisely the skills necessary for the standard Mongol battlefield encirclement tactic. They were, in essence, practicing war while hunting year after year throughout their lives. Thus, when people characterize Mongol cavalry as some brilliant innovation created by Genghis Khan, they miss the reality. Genghis Khan didn't invent this. He merely organized a system that had evolved organically over generations, a culture that had inadvertently perfected a military training program without ever labeling it as such. The steppe itself was the academy, and the diploma it conferred was written in the language of the composite bow. Consider this crucial number: 400 meters. That was the maximum range a Mongol archer could achieve with a ballistic shot, designed not for precision targeting, but to arc and rain arrows down on enemy formations. 400 meters is roughly equivalent to 4 American football fields. For targeted, accurate fire, a range of 150 to 175 meters was feasible. In comparison, the English longbow, which the English considered so advanced that they legally mandated its practice every Sunday, had a maximum effective range of approximately 200 meters, and it was physically impossible to fire from horseback. A standing posture was required just for the draw length, demanding a full-body exertion that no moving horse could accommodate. The Mongol composite bow represented an entirely different class of technology. It was more compact, sufficiently short to be drawn and fired in any direction while mounted on a galloping horse, yet it produced comparable or even greater power. Its sophisticated construction was the key. This was not an item carved from a single piece of wood. Instead, it was an engineered device meticulously crafted from various materials. Wood formed the core, animal horn was used on the belly, facing the target, and sinew from animal tendons was applied to the back. These 3 components worked in synergy, storing and releasing energy with remarkable efficiency. A skilled bowyer could spend years meticulously crafting a single composite bow. The adhesive required proper curing, and the materials needed to set under tension. Rushing the process would lead to the bow's failure. The Mongols diligently maintained these weapons, housing them in protective cases to guard against moisture and temperature fluctuations that could warp the materials and compromise their tension. This was a precision instrument, incidentally used for lethal purposes. I find the following construction detail particularly striking. The horn on the bow's belly, the surface facing the target, naturally resists compression. When the bow is drawn, the belly is compressed, and horn exhibits extraordinary resistance to this compression, storing energy instead of deforming. Conversely, the sinew on the back of the bow, facing the archer, naturally resists tension. As the bow is drawn, the back stretches under tension, and sinew can store this stretched energy much like a spring. Combining these 2 materials with a wooden core that provides structural integrity results in a bow that stores energy through 2 distinct physical processes concurrently. Upon release, both processes unleash their stored energy simultaneously. This is precisely why a short composite bow can rival or surpass the power of a much longer wooden bow. Its efficacy isn't about its physical dimensions, but rather the inherent physics of its constituent materials. While the Mongols did not articulate physics in scientific terms, they had perfected engineering through centuries of hands-on refinement. Now consider the archer's capabilities with this weapon. Mongol archers typically carried 2 or 3 bows, a heavier one for dismounted use and a lighter one optimized for horseback. They transported multiple quivers, each containing 60 arrows. They also carried small files for sharpening arrowheads in the field. These arrowheads were not uniform, they were specialized for distinct applications. There were armor-piercing heads, hardened by heating iron to a red glow and quenching it in brine to elevate the carbon content, creating a tougher cutting edge. Broadheads were designed to inflict wounds that would not easily close. Whistling arrows, featuring hollow heads with holes that shrieked through the air, were specifically employed to disorient enemy horses and soldiers before direct engagement. Incendiary arrows, with tips wrapped in naphtha-soaked material and ignited just before firing, added another dimension. Additionally, signal arrows were used to coordinate troop movements on the battlefield, serving as the Mongol equivalent of radio communication. A Mongol warrior entering battle wasn't carrying a single weapon. He wielded an entire weapons system. A seasoned archer could achieve a firing rate of approximately 6 arrows per minute from horseback. Performing the calculation for a tumen, a unit of 10,000 Mongol warriors, even if only half of them were actively shooting at any given moment, translates to 30,000 arrows per minute emanating continuously from that formation. This barrage had an accurate range extending to 150 meters and a suppressive fire range of 400 meters. Nothing in the medieval world could counter such an assault. There was no defense against it that didn't involve entering that range, which implied traversing hundreds of meters of exposed ground under a constant hail of arrows. The arrows themselves targeted horses as much as men. The Mongols possessed specific arrowhead designs engineered for dispatching horses, recognizing that a dismounted knight in full plate armor was merely an incredibly expensive and barely mobile infantryman. However, the most terrifying tactic wasn't solely the sheer volume of fire. It was what Mongol archers could achieve while retreating. The Parthian shot, named after ancient Iranian warriors who employed a similar technique centuries prior, refers to the ability to twist in the saddle while riding away from the enemy and accurately fire backward. The Mongols mastered this collectively. Their renowned feigned retreat was more than a tactical deception. It was also an active, lethal operation. As the enemy pursued what appeared to be a fleeing cavalry, the Mongols consistently fired backward into the pursuing formation. They inflicted casualties even as they fled. There's a particular biomechanical aspect to this that I find astonishing. Some researchers propose that setting an arrow free from horseback is best done when all four of the horse's hooves are simultaneously airborne, a fleeting moment occurring at the peak of each gallop. At that precise instant, the rider's platform achieves stability. A skilled Mongolian archer could instinctively sense this exact moment and release their arrow, having spent so much time on horseback that the animal's movements mirrored their own breathing patterns. Furthermore, the arrows themselves were products of sophisticated design. Arrowheads were sharpened in the field and affixed to shafts fletched for stable flight. Before every significant engagement, the army's arrows underwent inspection and preparation. This was not a secondary consideration. It was a matter of logistics treated with the same gravity as any other military supply. The bow, the horse, and the archer, three distinct components, each remarkable in its own right, collectively formed something unparalleled in the 13th century world. However, there's a reason I've deferred discussing individual Mongol warriors until now. Even extraordinary personal prowess at this caliber fails to account for the events at Lika or Mohi. It doesn't explain the synchronized two-country invasion I initially described. For those achievements, you need something more complex to construct than a composite bow. You need an organization. I would contend that Genghis Khan's brilliance in organization surpassed even the revolutionary capabilities of his cavalry's weaponry. If you find this analysis insightful, and you desire more in-depth military history explorations, please consider subscribing now. We delve into such detail in every video. Let's now turn our attention to the system that bound all this together. In 1206, when Genghis Khan united the Mongol tribes and declared himself Great Khan, he accomplished something on a scale almost unprecedented for conquerors throughout history. He dismantled the existing army and meticulously rebuilt a new one from its foundations. The previous Mongol military structure was predicated on tribal allegiance. One fought for their chieftain, and chieftains fought for their alliances, with clear distinctions between one's own people and the enemy along tribal lines. This system had endured for centuries on the steppe, but it harbored a critical flaw. Any shift in tribal loyalty caused the army to fragment. Genghis Khan had first-hand experience with this, witnessing betrayals, defections, and allies transforming into adversaries overnight. He understood better than anyone that an army founded on personal and tribal bonds possessed inherent structural weaknesses. Consequently, he eradicated that foundation. He took warriors from diverse tribes and assigned them to units based on his organizational framework, rather than their origins. A man from the Karaite tribe might find himself in the same Arban, the fundamental unit of 10, as individuals from the Nayman, Merkit, or Tatar tribes, people who not long before had been sworn enemies. Now they shared meals, trained, fought, and relied on each other for survival. This was a deliberate and ruthless form of social engineering, and it proved effective precisely as Genghis Khan intended. Over time, these men's loyalties shifted from their tribes to their units, and from their units to the Khan. The old divisions vanished. The organizational structure he imposed on this new army was the decimal system, comprising units of 10, 100, 1,000, and 10,000. The Arbon of 10 served as the basic squad. 10 Arbons formed a zun of 100. 10 zuns constituted a mingan of 1,000, and 10 mingans made up a tumen of 10,000, which was the primary operational unit of the Mongol army. What truly made this military structure brilliant, transcending mere administrative convenience, was that each tier of this hierarchy could operate independently. A tumen could fragment into mingans that dispersed and then reassembled. A mingan could divide into zuns that advanced along separate axes, all the way down to the Arbon. 10 men capable of conducting reconnaissance, ambushes, or raids on their own initiative, without needing orders from above. Contrast this with the armies the Mongols faced. A European feudal army in the 13th century was essentially a collection of personal retinues rallied around a lord. It comprised a few thousand actual knights and trained men-at-arms, professional warriors. The vast majority were tens of thousands of levied infantry, farmers, craftsmen, men compelled by feudal obligation, who might have received only a day or two of basic training. Against them came an entirely professional force where every soldier had undergone rigorous lifelong training, and even the smallest unit possessed the capacity for tactical thought and action. It was fundamentally an unfair contest. It was never destined to be otherwise. Furthermore, leadership within the Mongol system was revolutionary for its era, with promotion based solely on merit. Genghis Khan would promote individuals to high command based on demonstrated aptitude, even if they were from conquered peoples or former adversaries. His elite general, Subutai, who originated from humble beginnings, rose to become arguably the most accomplished operational commander of the medieval era. He directed campaigns across 3 continents and achieved victory in over 60 battles, not due to lineage, but because of his exceptional proficiency. This merit-based system permeated every echelon of the military, fostering a unique command structure. Officers at every level were expected to exhibit initiative, adapt to shifting conditions, and make decisions without constant directives from above. This principle, now a fundamental aspect of contemporary military doctrine, known as mission command, or by its German equivalent, Auftragstaktik, was practiced by the Mongols as early as the 13th century. Prior to any invasion, extensive intelligence gathering, spanning months or even years, would be completed. Mongol reconnaissance agents, often disguised as merchants, would traverse target territories, pinpointing water sources, assessing road networks, identifying defensive vulnerabilities, uncovering political divisions, and noting local grievances that could be leveraged. The Mongols frequently possessed a more comprehensive understanding of their enemy's homeland than the enemy's own generals. Furthermore, their communications framework during campaigns was unparalleled in the medieval world. The Yam, their imperial relay horse system, enabled messages to traverse hundreds of miles within days. Field commanders remained well-informed, ensuring coordination across vast distances remained feasible. This sophisticated system allowed for simultaneous invasions of multiple countries. For instance, in 1241, the Mongol left flank, attacking Poland, was fully aware of the main army's operations in Hungary and maintained synchronization with the overall operational timeline. This was not merely fortunate or impromptu. It represented a fully functional military communications infrastructure that was absent in the armies they encountered. Considering the Mongol military system in its entirety, the prowess of their horses, their mastery of the bow, their decimal organization, their meritocratic leadership, their meticulous intelligence preparation, and their advanced communication networks, it becomes less surprising that they achieved such frequent victories. Instead, one might marvel that any force ever managed to halt their advance. This leads us to the crucial question of their actual combat methodologies. Understanding the underlying system is one thing. Observing its execution is quite another. To begin this segment, I feel a crucial clarification is necessary. The Mongols are often depicted as overpowering adversaries through sheer numerical superiority and raw aggression. If you've delved into accounts of medieval warfare, you've likely encountered this mental image: the Mongol horde, an immense, seemingly countless multitude of horsemen overwhelming all opposition through sheer force of numbers alone. This portrayal, however, is inaccurate. Mongol cavalry rarely surpassed their opponents in numbers on the battlefield. In fact, they frequently engaged forces that were substantially larger. A typical tumen comprised 10,000 riders, and major campaigns might deploy only 2 or 3 such tumens of actual Mongol cavalry, supplemented by allied and subjugated troops. Yet, the core Mongol contingent, the cavalry instrumental in these conquests, was often the numerically inferior army on the battleground. Their success stemmed from their superior strategic acumen, a point we will now explore in detail. The cornerstone Mongol battlefield maneuver is what military historians term the feigned retreat. Its effectiveness was so consistent and decisive that its continued success against new adversaries, who should have received prior intelligence from previous enemies, is genuinely astonishing. The explanation for this phenomenon reveals valuable insights into the human psychology of combat. But first, let's dissect the tactic itself. The feigned retreat is straightforward to describe, yet exceedingly difficult to execute. A segment of the Mongol force, typically the light cavalry, engages the enemy, draws them into conflict, and then appears to break contact and rapidly withdraw. This apparent disarray, seemingly a flight from the battlefield, prompts the enemy to pursue. This is where the tactic becomes particularly ingenious. The pursuing force invariably commits 3 critical errors simultaneously. Firstly, their formation disintegrates as they chase rather than advance in an organized manner. Secondly, their swiftest riders surge ahead, becoming separated from the bulk of their army. Thirdly, they advance in a direction pre-selected by the Mongols, moving away from any defensive positions they initially held. Meanwhile, heavy cavalry and additional light cavalry units, covertly positioned on the flanks, initiate their movement. They remain concealed until the pursuing force is fully committed, at which point the seemingly fleeing Mongols abruptly pivot. The mechanics of this reversal were meticulously drilled. A Mongol cavalry unit possessed the ability to halt, turn, and regroup with impressive speed. Their lifelong familiarity with riding, the instinctive responsiveness of their mounts, and hundreds of iterations of this precise maneuver during training exercises like the Nurj hunts meant that this wasn't an unruly crowd wheeling around. It was a perfectly executed military movement. The flanking cavalry closed in from both sides, while the retreating force, now reversed, surged forward. The pursuing enemy, scattered, disorganized, committed to the wrong direction, and riding exhausted horses, suddenly found themselves encircled as arrows began to rain down. The insidious genius of this tactic was its ability to use the adversary's aggression against them. It relied on the enemy's bravery to advance. That very courage was then exploited for their destruction. The knights who charged most fiercely were the first to fall. I'm continually struck by its effectiveness. At the Kala River in 1223, Mongol generals Subutai and Jebi employed this very strategy against a combined Russian and Kipchak army, estimated between 40,000 and 80,000 strong. Despite being significantly outnumbered, the Mongols engaged in 9 days of strategic maneuvering, culminating in the complete annihilation of the Russo-Kipchak forces. Prince Mstislav the Bold of Galach managed to escape with only a few men. Prince Mstislav III of Kiev surrendered, was captured, and, as some accounts claim, was executed by being suffocated under planks to avoid spilling his noble blood, a particular Mongol custom for defeated but honored foes. The surviving Russians returned home with tales of what had transpired, and 14 years later, the Mongols returned with a larger army and replicated their success. The second primary tactical method was the envelopment, known to the Mongols as tulugma, a direct evolution of the hunting circles previously described. A tumen would advance with its wings extended far beyond the central force. These wings possess sufficient mobility to outflank any traditional enemy formation. Light cavalry on the wings would engage to draw the enemy's attention, while the wings continued their extension, eventually curving inwards at the rear. By the time most commanders grasped the situation, their army was either partially or fully surrounded, and the Mongols dictated the fighting distance, always just outside the effective range of opposing weapons, but within reach of their own composite bows. The Battle of Mohi in 1241 offers a quintessential example of the Mongol operational system at its peak. King Bela IV of Hungary commanded a sizable force of roughly 60,000 men. He established a fortified camp near the Saijo River. Subutai, overseeing the entire campaign, dispatched a diversionary force under Batu Khan to directly assault the bridge over the Saijo. This created enough pressure to confine Bela's attention to that one threat. Then, Subutai personally led a separate force across the river at a different downstream location under the cover of night, appearing undetected behind the Hungarian encampment at dawn. What ensued was not a battle in the traditional sense, but a methodical dismantling of an army trapped in an untenable position. Bela's forces were encircled from multiple directions. When the Hungarians attempted to assemble and break out, Mongol arrow fire thwarted every organized resistance effort. A revealing detail concerning Mongol thought is that they intentionally left one escape route open, not out of compassion, but from shrewd calculation. A surrounded army that believes its fate is certain death will fight with extraordinary desperation. Men convinced they are doomed become formidable adversaries. However, offer them an aperture, a path that hints at escape, and they will gravitate towards it. They cease to be an organized defensive unit and transform into a fleeing rabble. And a fleeing rabble can be leisurely ridden down and eliminated. The Mongols pursued the Hungarians for 2 days following the battle. The slaughter extended for miles, with contemporary records describing the plain as being strewn with bodies for a distance equivalent to a 2-day journey. Bela IV escaped, spending the subsequent months fleeing across Europe, from Croatia to the Adriatic coast, as Mongol raiding parties pursued him. He was, as one historian noted, the most relentlessly pursued king in medieval European history. On the battlefield itself, the Mongols leveraged their advanced communication systems, drums, horns, signal flags, to coordinate intricate multi-unit movements in real time. Units responded instantly to these signals, eliminating the delays associated with messengers or direct orders. This provided Mongol commanders with a speed of tactical adaptation that their adversaries simply could not match. By the time a European field commander managed to relay a new order to his units, the Mongol formation had often already undergone 2 changes. Additionally, there were smaller, yet cumulatively significant tactical details. Mongol warriors deliberately targeted enemy horses, even possessing specialized arrowheads designed specifically for this purpose. Depriving the cavalry of its mounts turns it into sluggish infantry. They ingeniously employed smoke screens and dust clouds to obscure their movements, preventing adversaries from observing flanking maneuvers and concealing their true numbers. They even deployed dummies crafted from felt on extra horses to inflate their apparent strength, making a force of 10,000 appear to be 20,000. Beyond these physical tactics was a crucial psychological aspect that warrants separate consideration. The Mongols grasped a concept many contemporary armies missed. Victory wasn't forged on the day of battle itself. It was cultivated in the weeks and months leading up to it, within the minds of those who would ultimately face them. They meticulously and systematically cultivated a reputation for absolute, unyielding annihilation of any resistance. If a city resisted and subsequently fell, its entire populace, from men to women, children, and even animals in the streets, could be massacred. A select few survivors would be intentionally allowed to escape, tasked with disseminating this chilling tale to the next city on their path. Upon hearing these accounts and encountering the survivors, that subsequent city confronted an unambiguous choice: fight and face certain death, or surrender and potentially survive. Many opted for surrender, leading to numerous cities falling without a single battle fought. This was not mere wanton savagery, it was a calibrated strategy, executed with the same rigorous discipline as every other facet of the Mongol military machine. Terror served as a force multiplier, and the Mongols leveraged it as such. The true military brilliance in all this, and I want to emphasize this directly, lay in the fact that these tactics demanded a rare combination of attributes seldom found together in an army. They required instantaneous speed and enduring patience in equal measure. They called for individual martial skill and collective discipline simultaneously. They necessitated aggressive action alongside calculated restraint. A feigned retreat, for instance, fails utterly if the retreating cavalry succumbs to panic and genuinely flees. An encirclement collapses if the flanking cavalry advances prematurely, alerting the enemy. The psychological warfare falters if the army lacks the discipline to refrain from massacring cities after they've surrendered. The Mongols managed to uphold all these delicate balances across numerous campaigns, over multiple continents, under different commanders, and against adversaries with vastly different fighting styles and environmental conditions. This was no mere fortune, it was a finely tuned system. There's a prevalent narrative of the Mongol cavalry that focuses solely on open-field engagements, tactics, and overwhelming speed and ferocity. This account, however, overlooks a significant element. The Mongols didn't exclusively wage war in broad, open spaces. The world they were conquering was replete with fortified cities, which represented the paramount defensive architecture of the 13th century. The entire military rationale behind fortifications rested on a straightforward premise. If an attacker's movement could be halted, their primary advantage would be neutralized. A cavalry army positioned outside city walls cannot outrun a wall's height. It cannot maneuver around solid stone. It cannot rain arrows upon defenders firing back from battlements without incurring substantial losses. The early Mongol campaigns immediately encountered this formidable challenge. During the initial offensives against the Jin dynasty in northern China, beginning around 1211, Genghis Khan's forces encountered heavily fortified cities equipped with advanced Chinese defensive technologies, including multiple walls, moats, and gatehouses impervious to sieges. The Mongol cavalry, which had been decimating Jin armies in open combat, found itself unable to capture Jin's cities using the same methodologies. Most conquerors faced with such an obstacle either falter or spend years enduring protracted sieges city by city. The Mongols, however, adopted a response characteristic of their innovative approach. They sought out individuals possessing the expertise to overcome this hurdle and integrated these experts into their military. Chinese siege engineers were incorporated into Mongol forces, sometimes willingly when cities surrendered, and sometimes forcibly when they did not. These engineers brought with them the cutting-edge technology of their civilization, the trebuchet, the mangonel, and the counterweight catapult. They contributed their knowledge of undermining walls through tunneling, diverting rivers to flood fortifications, and constructing siege towers and covered assault ramps. The Mongols proved to be exceptionally quick learners. By the time of the Middle Eastern campaigns under Hulagu Khan in the 1250s, the Mongol army deployed an extensive siege train that included approximately 1,000 Chinese engineering teams. These were not merely auxiliary units, they were fully integrated into the operational planning of the campaign. A city's siege was meticulously coordinated, with cavalry simultaneously cutting off all supply routes, engineering teams preparing assault positions, and psychological operations broadcasting demands for surrender. The siege of Baghdad in 1258 stands as the clearest illustration of this comprehensive system in action. Baghdad was more than just a city, it had served as the seat of the Abbasid Caliphate, the spiritual and political heart of the Sunni Islamic world, for 5 centuries. His position as the Caliph al-Mustasim, a towering symbolic figure of the medieval era, led him to a grave tactical error. He operated under the conviction that Baghdad's defense rested as much on his esteemed reputation as on its fortifications. He was convinced that no invader would dare to incur the divine wrath associated with attacking the heart of Islam. Consequently, he dispatched a contemptuous refusal to Hulagu Khan's demand for surrender. Hulagu responded by encircling the city with cavalry, sealing off all avenues of escape, deploying engineering units to critical assault positions, and initiating a systematic artillery barrage. The siege endured for 13 days. When the city's defenses were breached and it capitulated in February 1258, the resulting devastation was so immense that even contemporary accounts, including those from Islamic historians, who had no motive to inflate Mongol military prowess, described it with an air of profound disbelief. Libraries housing centuries of scientific and literary works were incinerated. The intricate canal and irrigation networks, which had sustained the region's agriculture for millennia, were obliterated. The caliph himself was executed. The Mongols consistently framed their destruction as the inevitable outcome of choosing armed resistance, a narrative that itself served as a psychological weapon against the next city in their path. The stark contrast with cities that chose surrender is well documented. Samarkand, a prominent Central Asian metropolis, offered brief resistance in 1220 and was utterly ravaged. However, other cities along the Silk Road that submitted without a fight were preserved, integrated into the Mongol trade network, and thrived under Mongol rule. This wasn't arbitrary. The Mongols were engaged in empire building, not mere plunder. They required functional cities for taxation and commerce. Their violence was precisely calculated to induce the submission necessary for peaceful assimilation. This aspect of the Mongol saga challenges the common perception of them as purely savage horsemen. It necessitates acknowledging the sophisticated systemic thinking of their leadership. Genghis Khan, his successors, and his generals were not merely acting on impulse. They executed a refined strategic agenda that leveraged violence to achieve specific political and economic objectives. The development of siege capabilities was the culmination of this strategy. Without it, the Mongol cavalry could terrorize an empire, but not truly control it. Cities would simply shelter behind their walls, recuperate, and eventually re-emerge. With integrated siege warfare and the capacity to subdue any city that refused to yield, the Mongols eliminated the final sanctuary. There was no longer any place to hide. No defensive architecture could guarantee survival. The sole variable became whether one surrendered before or after the army's arrival. This widespread realization across the medieval world that even stone walls offered no protection became in itself a strategic weapon forged jointly by the cavalry and the siege engineers. I have primarily focused on the capabilities of the Mongol cavalry. However, there's another equally compelling question that offers deeper insight into the system's operational mechanics. Where did it falter? Because it did falter, and the specific locations and circumstances of these failures are not random. They exhibit a discernible pattern, illuminating the precise conditions essential for the Mongol military system to function effectively. The initial and most significant setback in their westward expansion occurred at the Battle of Ain Jalut in September 1260, located in what is now northern Israel at the southern edge of the Galilee region. To grasp the profound importance of this battle, one must understand its historical context. By 1260, Hulagu Khan's Mongols had just razed Baghdad, dismantled the assassin strongholds in Persia, and swept through Syria with virtually no substantial opposition. Damascus had fallen. Aleppo had fallen. Crusader states were dispatching envoys to discuss alliances. Everyone in the region was desperately seeking a way to survive what appeared to be an unstoppable march westward. The sole power that opted to confront rather than negotiate was the Mamluk Sultanate of Egypt. Their sultan, Qutuz, made a decision that demanded extraordinary courage. He advanced northward to engage the Mongols rather than awaiting their arrival in Egypt. The Mamluk army that encountered the Mongols at Ain Jalut was itself a formidable cavalry force, and the Mamluks, military slaves largely of Kipchak Turkish descent, were exceptional horsemen and archers. They had observed the Mongols for decades. They thoroughly understood their tactics. They had absorbed the bitter lessons of every army that had fallen prey to Mongol feigned retreats. At Ain Jalut, the Mamluk general Baibars employed a feigned retreat against the Mongols. He lured the Mongol cavalry into rugged terrain, a landscape of hills and constricted passages where their numerical cavalry superiority was diminished, and their signature envelopment tactic became exceedingly difficult to execute. Then, the main Mamluk force, which had been concealed, launched a devastating assault on the Mongol flanks. The Mongol contingent at Ain Jalut, comprising an estimated 10,000 to 20,000 soldiers, a significantly smaller force than those that had previously conquered Baghdad due to the majority of Hulagu Khan's army being recalled following the demise of the great Khan Manka, suffered a decisive defeat. Their commander, Kitbu Khan Noyan, was apprehended and subsequently executed. Despite several subsequent efforts to reclaim Syria, each attempt by the Mongols was thwarted by Mamluk resistance, effectively halting the Mongols' westward advance. What deeper insights does the Battle of Ain Jalut provide? I believe it offers two key takeaways. Firstly, the Mongol military apparatus was not inherently invincible. It could be overcome by an adversary possessing comparable cavalry prowess, a thorough grasp of Mongol tactics to effectively counter them, and the strategic foresight to engage on terrain that hindered Mongol maneuverability. Secondly, and perhaps more crucially, the Mongol forces at Ain Jalut were operating at a disadvantage, reduced in numbers, unfamiliar with the local topography, geographically detached from their supply lines, and at a moment of internal political contention. The system was impaired, rather than definitively overcome at its peak proficiency. However, even a diminished system is susceptible to losing battles, and this distinction holds considerable importance. The setbacks encountered in Japan during 1274 and 1281 exposed an entirely distinct vulnerability. The Mongol military doctrine was intrinsically designed for the open steppes, where ample space facilitated maneuvering and the execution of envelopment strategies. Maritime invasions, however, fundamentally negated every advantage inherent to their cavalry. Horses and their riders were confined to ships. While a composite bow retained its efficacy on shore, reaching the shore itself presented a formidable challenge, especially against the formidable Japanese samurai who defended their familiar coastlines. The initial invasion in 1274 saw actual landings in Kyushu, where fierce Japanese resistance was met before a withdrawal. The subsequent invasion in 1281 involved a vastly larger force, estimated between 100,000 and 140,000 men, transported by a combined Mongol, Chinese, and Korean fleet. It was then that a typhoon struck. Contemporary Japanese accounts recounted a storm of unparalleled ferocity, and modern geological studies have unearthed physical evidence corroborating a major typhoon in the region around that specific time. An estimated 60 to 90% of the fleet was annihilated, preventing the army from establishing a significant foothold ashore. The Japanese referred to this typhoon as kamikaze, the divine wind, a term that would echo throughout Japanese military culture for the ensuing 7 centuries. Campaigns in Southeast Asia, specifically Vietnam, Burma, and Java, revealed yet another limitation. In the dense jungle and tropical environments, horses transformed from assets into liabilities. The animals succumbed to heat exhaustion and unfamiliar diseases. The open country strategies, which relied on expansive visibility, ample space, and the utilization of speed, proved utterly ineffectual in terrain where visibility was limited to merely 10 meters and movement was measured in hours rather than kilometers. Vietnamese forces under the Tran dynasty successfully repelled Mongol incursions in 1258, 1285, and again in 1287 to 88, 3 distinct attempts spanning 3 decades. On each occasion, the Vietnamese deliberately avoided open field engagements, instead disrupting Mongol supply routes, leveraging the natural terrain and climate to their advantage, and then striking when the Mongols were fatigued and overextended. The Tran general, Tran Hung Dao, who commanded the later defenses, grasped a fundamental principle. If the cavalry is denied the optimal battle conditions it requires, it cannot prevail. Withhold the open ground, impede their advance. Allow the oppressive heat and endemic diseases to achieve what arrows could not. Beyond these external challenges, there was the internal fragmentation. Following the death of Mongol Khan in 1259, the question of succession fractured the empire. The four primary khanates, once integral components of a unified military structure, began to operate as independent entities, each pursuing its own distinct interests. The Golden Horde and the Ilkhanate engaged in warfare against each other, while the Chagatai Khanate found itself in conflict with both. The overarching strategic coordination that had enabled simultaneous invasions of Poland and Hungary in 1241 became unattainable as the constituent parts of the system actively turned against one another. The Mongol cavalry, at its pinnacle, was not merely a collection of skilled individual units, it was a cohesive system, and systems demand the harmonious functioning of all their components. When this political cohesion dissolved, the military system deteriorated alongside it. What truly remains remarkable, upon stepping back and viewing the complete historical panorama, is not where the system ultimately failed, but rather the sheer extent of its success before any failure materialized. The Mongol Empire is frequently characterized as a saga of destruction, and that destruction was undeniably real. The associated casualty figures are staggering, with historians estimating that between 20 and 60 million individuals perished as a direct or indirect consequence of the Mongol conquests throughout the 13th and 14th centuries. Before the Mongol incursions, Chinese territories reportedly supported a population of around 120 million. The census of 1300, conducted after the completion of the conquest, recorded approximately 60 million. Even when acknowledging the historical imprecision of these figures, and conceding that some of the population decrease may stem from administrative record-keeping failures rather than actual fatalities, the degree of upheaval in the medieval world stood unprecedented. Consider the irrigation networks of Mesopotamia, crucial infrastructure that had been developed and maintained over millennia, sustaining agriculture in one of Earth's most fertile regions. These were obliterated during the conquests of Iraq and Iran. The human toll of this devastation persisted for generations after the armies had moved on. All these facts are undeniable, and it would be disingenuous to downplay them in a discussion about the impressive nature of the Mongol military machine. However, another aspect of the narrative exists, running concurrently with the destruction and equally valid. The Pax Mongolica, or Mongol Peace, denotes a period of relative stability across the Eurasian landmass following the culmination of major conquests, roughly from the mid-13th to the early 14th century. For the first time, a singular political power held sway over the entire length of the Silk Road, stretching from China to Europe's frontiers. Merchants could traverse this route, a journey that previously involved navigating dozens of rival political entities, each with its own levies, hazards, and potential for banditry or conflict, under a unified legal framework, bolstered by Mongol postal stations offering information and logistical aid along the way. Commerce thrived. Knowledge circulated with trade. Chinese papermaking techniques journeyed westward. Islamic mathematical and astronomical insights moved eastward. Agricultural methods traversed continents. Tragically, the Black Death also spread along these very routes. The interconnectedness that facilitated trade simultaneously allowed the plague to escalate into a pandemic. Yet the exchange of knowledge and technology brought about tangible and enduring improvements in the lives of people far removed from any battlefield. The Franciscan friar William of Rubruck, who visited the Mongol court in 1253 on behalf of the French monarch, encountered Chinese artisans, European goldsmiths, a Persian engineer, a Nestorian Christian priest, and a Buddhist monk, all within the same court in the capital of a Mongolian empire at the heart of Asia. This single observation reveals something extraordinary about that era. The Mongol conquests had inadvertently forged a unified Eurasian space where individuals and concepts moved with a freedom that would not re-emerge for centuries. The military legacy is more straightforward. However, the Mamluk Sultanate, which successfully halted the Mongols at Ain Jalut, itself embodied cavalry principles and organizational frameworks honed by decades of exposure to Mongol warfare. The Ottoman military system, destined to dominate the Middle East and southeastern Europe for multiple centuries afterward, integrated elements of Mongol decimal organization and a merit-based command culture. Russian military evolution over subsequent centuries was profoundly shaped by the experience of operating under Mongol political authority. The impact of the Golden Horde on Russian military and administrative practices continues to be documented and debated by historians to this day. In the 20th century, military scholars examining the Blitzkrieg campaigns of the Second World War observed structural commonalities with Mongol operational thinking. The emphasis on velocity over sheer numbers, on the psychological incapacitation of the enemy rather than methodical force attrition, on deep incursions that bypassed fortified positions instead of relentlessly grinding through them. The officers who conceived these strategies were students of Napoleonic and earlier military history, not Mongolian history. Nevertheless, the underlying operational rationale appears to be a rediscovery of principles the Mongols had developed 700 years prior, precisely because these principles reflect a fundamental truth about how mobile forces can be most effectively deployed against an adversary reliant on static defenses. There is also an earnest argument put forth by some historians that the Mongol conquests, despite all their devastation, accelerated the transfer of technology that ultimately paved the way for the European Renaissance and the early modern period. The dissemination of Chinese innovations, gunpowder, printing, advanced metallurgy, into the Islamic world and subsequently Europe occurred more swiftly and comprehensively because the Silk Road was briefly, violently unified under a single authority. The gunpowder that made 14th-century European cannons possible traced its transmission route through the Mongol Empire. None of this negates the destruction. History does not operate in such a manner. One cannot offset 40 million deaths with an improved trade route or a technological transfer. Yet, it adds complexity to a simplistic narrative. The most formidable cavalry in history was also, paradoxically, a significant driver of medieval globalization. The same organizational aptitude that facilitated the simulated retreat also paved the way for the Pax Mongolica. The identical pragmatic ruthlessness that allowed the sacking of Baghdad simultaneously ensured the preservation and prosperity of Samarkand. It's this nuance, the realization that the very framework enabling the massacre at Legnica also permitted William of Rubruck to encounter a Chinese artisan within a Mongolian capital, where, I believe, genuine historical comprehension truly begins. It's not in glorification nor in condemnation, but in the honest recognition that the most formidable military entity of the medieval era was also among the most multifaceted. So, let's circle back to our starting point. April 9th, 1241. Henry II of Silesia observes the Mongols' seemingly panicked flight, contemplating whether to pursue them. The atmosphere is thick with smoke and the blare of horns, the snare tightening. Henry's defeat wasn't due to a numerically superior adversary, but to a military force honed over generations. Not developed in barracks or formal armies, but on the steppes, in the saddle, through hunting, and in the daily customs of a civilization that had unconsciously refined itself for mounted warfare over centuries. Three primary factors in my assessment gave rise to the most dreaded cavalry known to history. Foremost was the horse itself. Not the majestic war horse of lore, but a diminutive, unassuming, yet incredibly resilient creature that required no grain, no established routes, no extensive supply chains, and could sustain movement when all other cavalry units globally were forced to halt. This animal emancipated the Mongol army from the fundamental limitation that constrained every other military power of the epoch: logistics. The Mongols advanced quicker than their adversaries could react because their horses rendered such speed physically attainable. Second was their systematic organization, the decimal arrangement, the merit-based chain of command, the extensive communication network, and meticulous intelligence gathering. These elements transformed individually exceptional warriors into a cohesive unit capable of coordinated action across hundreds of miles and multiple fronts simultaneously. Individual prowess alone often leads to defeat through disarray. The Mongol system ensured that individual excellence was amplified, not squandered. The third, and perhaps the most compelling factor to me, was their mentality, a readiness to learn, to assimilate Chinese siege engineering techniques, to scrutinize enemy tactics and repurpose them, and to integrate conquered populations and their skills into the army instead of simply annihilating everyone. Historically, most empires have collapsed due to their own inflexibility, their steadfast belief that past methods would perpetually succeed, that their own approach was inherently superior, and that adaptability signified weakness. The Mongols, conversely, embraced adaptation as a potent weapon, and indeed it proved to be. What I find truly astonishing, looking back from this 800-year remove, is that history's most feared cavalry wasn't a product of wealth, industrial might, or an abundance of raw materials or population size. The Mongols originated from one of the planet's most austere, resource-scarce environments, devoid of cities, factories, or formal military academies. What they possessed was a culture that instilled martial training in every man from boyhood, an organizational genius who understood how to transform that culture into a military apparatus, and the versatility to assimilate knowledge from every culture they encountered. This combination in the 13th century was sufficient to nearly subjugate the entire known world. On that note, if you've made it this far, your commitment to thorough understanding, not just what transpired, but why and how, is evident. This channel was specifically designed for exactly that purpose. If this video offered you new perspectives, even if you considered yourself knowledgeable about the Mongols, please hit the like button. It genuinely assists more individuals in discovering content of this nature. And if this level of in-depth exploration is what you seek more of, do subscribe. Every video we produce delves this deeply, every single time. I'll connect with you in the next one.